Evacuate, evacuate, evacuate. Seatbelts off. High heels off.
The initiation of the evacuation of a large passenger aircraft is relatively easy. Aircraft manufacturers provide checklists to make sure you get it right. Surely this won't come as a surprise to listeners of episode 3. On the other hand, arriving at the decision to evacuate is arguably one of the hardest a captain could ever be expected to make. Little wonder the decision-making process is practiced very deliberately during simulated training such as that we discussed in our previous 2 episodes. But why is the decision so hard? When a captain makes the decision to evacuate, he or she is well aware that people are going to get hurt. To meet certification requirements, aircraft manufacturers must demonstrate the ability to evacuate a full aircraft within 90 seconds using only half of its emergency exits. Sending hundreds of passengers and crew down escape slides, sometimes approaching angles of up to 45 degrees, invariably results in friction burns and fractures. Delay the decision, on the other hand, and people may die. On the 19th of August 1980, a Saudi Arabian Lockheed L-1011 experienced cargo compartment smoke indications shortly after takeoff from Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. A return to land was delayed for troubleshooting, during which time the fire intensified. After landing, further delays in stopping the aircraft and initiating evacuation led to all 301 passengers and crew perishing due to smoke inhalation and fire. Hello everybody, I'm Phil Wilkes. Welcome aboard the Like a Pilot podcast, where we unveil the soft skills pilots utilise every time they strap into those high-speed aluminium and carbon fibre giants we call airliners. This show is your ticket to understanding the how and why behind what makes aviation one of the safest modes of travel. In today's episode, we're investigating critical communication skills. We'll be investigating what we can learn from research into the best way to initiate an evacuation or seek help in an emergency. Along the way, we'll be visiting London and New York, and of course, taking a look at how aircrew communicate in critical situations. It's time to fasten your seatbelts and join me now as we embark on a journey through the skies, where pilot skills become the blueprints for high performance in any field. One question I'm often asked as a long-haul airline pilot is, what is your favourite place to visit? Having been a real science and maths nerd at school, it would no doubt come as a surprise to my schoolmates from Melbourne High that I like visiting cities where I can immerse myself into the history. Drop me anywhere in Italy, Japan, London. I'm immediately searching for guided history walks, and I'm not shy on hopping on a train for the odd shire-hopping day trip. Oxford, Cambridge, Buckinghamshire, Sussex. Train travel outside of London begins at one of several hub stations that connect the city to destinations across the UK and beyond. In turn, these overland stations are connected to the London Underground. Officially opened on the 10th of January 1863, the London Underground is the oldest metro system in the world. With this history comes a certain charm. The historical grandeur of intricate tilework, each station with its own colour scheme and motifs, and cosy, dimly lit platforms, all blending with modern functionality. Until the last examples were replaced by metal equivalents at Greenford Station as late as 2014, many stations even featured escalators with steps and balustrades finished in maple, oak, plywood. Let's take a trip back in time. It's the evening of Wednesday the 18th of November 1987 at King's Cross Underground Station. King's Cross is a major interchange station for above-ground main lines. Additionally, it serves as an interchange for no less than 6 lines of the underground itself, all connected by a veritable maze of passages, stairs and escalators. As passengers alight from the Piccadilly line this evening, they make their way up to street level on one of King's Cross wood-trimmed escalators. About 2/3 of the way up, one passenger notices smoke coming from under the steps and, as he passes the point from which the smoke is emanating, sees flames in the gap between the steps and side panel. Although the London Underground has seen a blanket ban on smoking since February 1985, smokers often ignore this and light cigarettes on the escalators on their way out. To thoroughly clean the escalators at London's busiest underground station would involve dismantling them. A lit match, discarded by a passenger, has fallen through a missing cleat at the side of the moving staircase onto the running tracks of the escalator and ignited the year's worth of accumulated grease, dust and debris. When he reaches the ticket hall, the passenger walks directly to a booking office window to report the fire. He accompanies the ticket clerk to the top of the escalator, from where they both observe the smoke. Back in his office, the clerk reports the smoke to the station's safety inspector and resumes selling tickets. Other passengers notice the fire on the escalator. One presses the emergency stop button and shouts a warning to fellow passengers. He's largely ignored. Most passengers continue their journey upwards, climbing the now stationary stairs past the scene of the growing fire. Two constables of the British Transport Police hear the shouts and see the smoke and the now 2 to 3 inch high flames. Their radios won't work underground, so one races to street level to call the London Fire Brigade. Around 6 minutes since the fire has been discovered, 4 fire appliances and a turntable ladder are on their way to the scene. By now, the safety inspector, who had initially proceeded to the wrong escalator, is at the scene of the fire, but his extinguisher can't reach the source of the flames. All the while, trains continue to arrive at the platforms, alighting more commuters who pile onto the stationary escalators and begin the climb to the top, a combination of ignorant or ambivalent to the smoke and fire ahead. No one has gone to the machine room to activate the manually controlled water sprinkler system. No one has been trained in its use. And no one has been trained in how to evacuate the station. Around 9 minutes since the fire was discovered, Transport Police and underground staff improvise a plan. They rope off the burning escalator and reroute passengers via tunnels to the Victoria Line escalators. But the alternative routing still brings passengers through the ticket hall, which is now filling with smoke. The fire is now raging, and the walls of the tunnels adjacent to it begin to sizzle in the heat being transferred. Despite all the obvious signs of a serious fire, passengers don't panic. They stand on the escalator they have been directed to by the police and patiently ride them to the top. In the ticket hall, the Transport Police have ordered the closure of the booking office windows. Passengers instead queue at the automatic ticket machines. And as police attempt to evacuate the ticket hall, passengers from street level push past in the opposite direction, descending into the smoke, determined to get to the train lines below. The London Fire Brigade arrive on the scene. The fire is now the size of a large cardboard box, but it is about to become suddenly and tragically much worse. Unfortunately, the firefighters have no way of predicting this. What is about to happen has never been recorded before. In what has since been defined as trench effect, fast-moving superheated gases are clinging to the sides and steeply sloping steps of the escalator. The materials they are made of, along with years of accumulated paint on the walls and ceiling, heat up and release flammable gases. Suddenly, these gases reach their flash point and ignite explosively. A wall of flame shoots up the escalator well and engulfs the ticket hall. 18 minutes since the fire was first reported, 31 people lose their lives. 18 minutes in which the sprinklers could have been activated. 18 minutes in which a public address could have been made to initiate the evacuation of the station. Beginning on the 1st of February 1988, a public inquiry sits for 91 days at Central Hall, Westminster. In precisely the manner in which an aviation accident investigation would proceed, the inquiry sets out to find not only the causes of the accident, but also what safeguards can be put in place to ensure it is not repeated, or, if it is, what mitigating actions can be taken to lessen the severity of the outcomes and preserve life. The inquiry establishes that, in the decades preceding the King's Cross fire, the London Underground had averaged around one escalator fire a month. At King's Cross itself, charred wood was found in 8 places on escalator skirting and running tracks, but each of these fires had burnt itself out without spreading. Did these hundreds of fatality-free fires across the network lead to systemic complacency? Staff had been given little to no training for dealing with fires or evacuation, and the expectation was that they would only call the London Fire Brigade if they were unable to control a fire themselves. Even the language used around fires downplayed their very real dangers. Fires weren't fires, they were smoulderings. The inquiry resulted in many changes to escalator wells at stations. Wooden panelling and other hazardous materials were removed. Fire detection and suppression equipment fitted. Additionally, radio communication systems and staff emergency training were improved and fire regulations introduced. The inquiry also researched the best way to initiate an evacuation. We'll return to the inquiry, but first we're heading to New York to investigate a murder, or, more accurately, the ramifications of a murder. It's the 27th of March 1964. The New York Times runs an article on its front page with the shocking title, 37 who saw murder didn't call police. Unlike the clickbait disguised as news by modern publications, in this case, the content is no less shocking than the title.
For more than half an hour, 38 respectable, law-abiding citizens in Queens watched a killer stalk and stab a woman in 3 separate attacks in Kew Gardens. Twice, the sound of their voices and the sudden glow of their bedroom lights interrupted him and frightened him off. Each time he returned, sought her out and stabbed her again. Not one person telephoned the police during the assault. One witness called after the woman was dead. That was 2 weeks ago today. But Assistant Chief Inspector Frederick M. Lusson, in charge of the borough's detectives and a veteran of 25 years of homicide investigations, is still shocked. He can give a matter-of-fact recitation of many murders. But the Kew Gardens slaying baffles him, not because it is a murder, but because the good people failed to call the police. As we have reconstructed the crime, he said, the assailant had 3 chances to kill this woman during a 35-minute period. He returned twice to complete the job. If we had been called when he first attacked, the woman might not be dead now.
How could so many people witness a woman in a desperate fight for her life and do nothing, not even call the police? In the wake of the Times article, the murder of 28-year-old Kitty Genovese spawned further articles, TV commentary, a book, even a play. It was also the trigger for research by social psychologists, specifically research into the phenomenon of bystander apathy. Now, before you shut off the podcast, crawl into a fetal position, and give up on humankind altogether, let me provide some reassurance that all is not lost. In the very best tradition of journalists not letting the truth stand in the way of a good story, there are issues with the New York Times article. Issues of fact. The Times themselves acknowledged this in 2004, publishing the following.
The article grossly exaggerated the number of witnesses and what they had perceived. None saw the attack in its entirety. Only a few had glimpsed parts of it or recognized the cries for help. Many thought they had heard lovers or drunks quarreling. There were 2 attacks, not 3, and afterward, 2 people did call the police. A 70-year-old woman ventured out and cradled the dying victim in her arms until they arrived. Ms. Genovese died on the way to a hospital.
The research by social psychologists is also reassuring. It affirms the empathy of strangers and at the same time gives us insight into why travellers at King's Cross Station didn't panic, instead appearing almost oblivious to the dire situation unfolding. The findings also provide insight into how best to communicate in any emergency. When social psychologists staged various emergencies to determine how bystanders react when faced with a crisis, in up to 90% of cases, a lone bystander would step in to render assistance. Experimentation on groups of 2 or more bystanders showed that the rendering of assistance fell below 38%. If an insider was planted in the group and this person deliberately took no action, rates of assistance fell to as low as 10%. Rather than being apathetic to rendering assistance, there seems to be something in play determined by group dynamics. Researchers postulated that maybe the reason why groups fail to act is precisely because they are a group. When in a group situation, we look for social evidence on how to act. We look to others to gauge what is appropriate. Am I the best person to step up here? Maybe someone else has already called for help. Am I actually witnessing an emergency at all? When we see no one else acting, when we see no one else expressing concern, we fall into pluralistic ignorance and tend towards doing nothing ourselves. It puts a whole new spin on the phrase safety in numbers, more like potential danger in numbers. These studies help us explain why the crowds of passengers at King's Cross didn't panic and run for their lives. Turn on any news broadcast or search YouTube within hours of the latest disaster. Invariably, you are met with scores of amateur videos showing that, while there may be panicked individuals, for the most part, we take our social cues from each other, tending to react in an orderly fashion. At our best, we help each other out, or, at our worst, stop to make a YouTube video. In the worst case scenario, as happened to so many in the tragedy that unfolded at King's Cross Station, we do nothing. With a lack of social cues suggesting we need to take action, we remain calm and react inappropriately, not comprehending the seriousness of the situation. No airline crew member would be surprised by these observations on social dynamics. Fire alarms at the hotels we stay at are activated with painful regularity, and almost always, it seems, while we're trying to sleep in advance of an upcoming back-of-the-clock duty. What happens? Rather than an en masse evacuation of the building, heads appear from doorways, looking for social cues and an impetus to evacuate, rather than wait for the false alarm public address that will invariably follow. Won't it? How often are emergencies just false alarms? So how could the King's Cross evacuation have been handled differently? And what does this tell us about time-critical communications in general? To answer the first of these questions, researchers attached to the inquiry into the King's Cross tragedy gathered at Newcastle's Monument Station. Monument was chosen as its design resembled a simplified version of London's King's Cross. Over 5 different days, they conducted experiments to ascertain how passengers would react to 5 different evacuation triggers. When the only trigger was a simple fire alarm, people ignored it. A generic announcement fared little better. At concourse level, passengers left the station, but those at the bottom of the now closed escalator didn't try to find an alternative way out. With most of them believing the evacuation was a false alarm, they remained below ground waiting for the escalator to reopen. Next, researchers recreated the King's Cross situation. No announcements were made, no evacuation plan was in place. 2 staff were told where the imaginary fire was located and were left to their own initiative as to how best to evacuate the station. Despite the best efforts of staff, passengers became confused as to what was expected of them. Worse still, passengers were directed along a route through the vicinity of the fire, the equivalent of the King's Cross ticket hall. Next, the researchers attempted an evacuation with a definite evacuation plan in place. Public addresses were made directing passengers on the platforms to evacuate by boarding the next available train. Passengers on the concourse were directed to evacuate by the nearest available exit. The station evacuated expeditiously. In their final experiment, the researchers added one additional element. They gave the reason for the evacuation, nominating both that there was a suspected fire requiring the evacuation of the station and its location within the station. Of the 5 experiments, this was the only one that resulted in the majority of passengers being convinced that there was a real threat, and this despite the lack of smoke or flames as supporting evidence. Being convinced an emergency exists is also critical when it comes to the rendering of assistance from bystanders. Convinced that an emergency exists, experiments have shown that bystanders will render assistance 98 to 100% of the time, even when it involves presenting themselves to elements of danger. When we're in group settings, humans don't suddenly become selfish or uncaring, but group dynamics can leave us unsure as to how we are expected to act. Remove this ambiguity, and we will step up with almost certainty. If faced with an emergency and requiring immediate assistance, the research is clear. Your best chance of receiving the assistance you need is by doing these 3 things. First, ensure that bystanders are certain that an emergency exists and that assistance is required. Second, instead of making a general request for assistance, target a specific individual. Make sure someone knows that they need to step in. Finally, be clear as to what assistance you need. Give explicit instructions. In aviation circles, ensuring our communications are fit for purpose is known as communicating with intent. Communicating with intent means pausing before engaging in any critical communication to consider what exactly it is you want to communicate. That is, what is the intent of your communication? What is the message you want to get across, or the actions you intend to set in play as the result of your communication? Communicating with intent also means considering the delivery style you intend to use and its potential impact on your target audience. As an example, in the case of an evacuation or other emergency, will the words, tone, volume, and pace you intend to use convey the required level of urgency, achieving the necessary level of expediency and compliance, while at the same time maintaining the desired level of reassurance and calm? In this respect, the style, tone, and level of your communication must be congruent with the intent of your message. Before pressing transmit on the radio, the PA, or opening your mouth for in-person communications, you need to put yourself in the intended recipient's shoes. How may they interpret your communication? Can you remove any ambiguities in interpretation with your careful choice of words? In the age of globalization, are there any cultural or language barrier aspects to consider? When dealing with critical communications, you may wish to consider communications templates to guide your communications. If there is no template, do you need to develop one of your own? Is there time to jot down some dot points? Are there certain communications that maybe you should be practicing through either mental or physical rehearsal? In aviation, we love a good protocol or template. Preparing for, initiating, and achieving the evacuation of an aircraft is no exception. Where it is clear that the need to evacuate an aircraft may exist, and time permits, the captain will use this time to brief the cabin manager in advance. As an aid to clear communications, this briefing may follow a framework. One such framework, used by many airlines, is known by the acronym NITS. A NITS briefing may even begin with the statement that what to follow is a NITS briefing. This is a NITS briefing. The N in NITS stands for the nature of the emergency situation. The I for the captain's intentions. The T is the time available before landing, impact or ditching, which the cabin crew will have available to prepare the cabin. The S stands for any special considerations or requirements. Effective communications are a two-way street. They involve not just the transmission of information, but also the receiving and understanding between the parties involved. As such, the NITS briefing structure is most effective when it also includes a readback from the cabin manager, ensuring that there is a shared mental model between the flight and cabin crews. Beyond the exact particulars of the emergency facing the crew, there is nothing ad hoc about a prepared evacuation. Using a carefully considered, timed, and rehearsed template, the cabin manager will use the information from the captain to brief their fellow cabin crew members and the passengers. There will certainly be a public address template to follow. When the captain orders an evacuation of the aircraft, in unison, the cabin crew will start issuing a set of very well considered and rehearsed instructions. At the same time, they'll be moving from their jump seats to their designated doors on the aircraft and checking the conditions outside. If there's no fire or other conditions rendering their door an unsafe exit, they'll open the door and block the exit until the slide raft has deployed. All the time, the instructions are repeated. As doors become available to exit, flight attendants either step aside and begin calling passengers to leave via the exit, or they continue to block unsafe paths and redirect passengers to the nearest available exit. Once everyone has evacuated, the crew themselves evacuate and direct passengers on the ground to a safe area or take control of the rafts in a ditching event and release them from the aircraft. The instructions used have been designed by aviation safety subject matter experts. Every single word carefully considered for its impact and effectiveness in the event of an unplanned or unexpected evacuation. They have been rehearsed, embedded in memory during a flight attendant's initial training, and they are tested annually. I'm going to finish this episode where I started, back in London. I was with a colleague headed to a show in the West End. Being a sunny weekend afternoon, we decided to take a long route and walk along the banks of the Thames. On our walk, we came across a couple of girls attempting to help a clearly dazed man to his feet. Maybe he was drunk. Probably their friend. They looked to have the situation in hand. Judging by the significant pedestrian traffic continuing on by, clearly this was the state of play. Now, possibly because my colleague and I had been contemplating the content of this very episode, we felt obliged to at least check that the situation was in hand. So we stopped and asked. On closer investigation, blood was pouring out of what was clearly a significant head wound. The girls didn't know the man at all. They had seen him stumble and faceplant into the pavement. He was incoherent, barely conscious. He clearly needed urgent medical assistance. As another pedestrian strolled past, I made sure I had eye contact with him. "You! This man has suffered a head injury. I need you to find a police officer. Ask them to call an ambulance. Now." We hadn't seen any police officers nearby, but within minutes we had police and paramedics in attendance. The gentleman was on his way to hospital, and my colleague and I continued on our way to our West End show. So there you have it. Sample size of 1, the psychologist's advice works, uncategorically. The Like a Pilot podcast is nothing if not scientifically rigorous. Until next time, thank you for listening to the Like a Pilot podcast. For more information, check out the show notes at philwilkes.com/podcast. The Like a Pilot podcast is written and produced by me, Phil Wilkes. Additional voice talent, Kirsty McDonald, Brenton Hardy, Luke Zakaria, Joe Gallagher. If you'd like to support the Like a Pilot podcast, our Patreon page is available at patreon.com/likeapilot. And remember, if you've liked the show, please rate, share, and review.